Good morning. To continue our Who Was Dr. Seuss book today. If you were with us yesterday, we were reading the story, The Sneetches and Other Stories. The Sneetches was about how we weren't always treating the people who had different colored skin the same. And Dr. Seuss used that by showing Sneetches with stars on their bellies or not, until it got so confusing that the guy didn't even know, and the other Sneetches didn't even know which ones were the real Sneetches that started with stars and which ones were the old Sneetches. Just showing kind of how silly it was to look at someone based on what they have for stuff on their body, whether it's the color of their skin or their clothes or their hair color or their eye color. Anything that's not about what you're like on the inside is not good to be judging people. So it was hard work writing all those books. Ted would spend 8 hours a day at his desk 7 days a week. He said that he did his best work when he wrote himself into a corner. So when there was seemingly no end to the book, then he'd finally write his way out. Helen had to deal with a lot of Ted's mood swings. Sometimes he'd be really happy, sometimes he'd be really upset. About 2 weeks before he would finish every book, he would say that the book was no good at all, and he was going to throw the whole thing away. And Helen would have to talk him out of throwing the whole thing away and helping him to finish the end of his books. After he finished the book, he was just as bad. He would worry that I've lost it. I'm never going to be able to write anything again. I just can't do it. But then one of his doodles would start his mind working again, and he would start writing again. Work was always the center of Ted's life, but sometimes he did take a break. Him and Helen still liked traveling the world. Remember at the beginning of the story when they met, they would like to travel and collect hats from all these different places. They loved to look at elephant seals in Mexico. In Peru, they helped search for mummies. And in Australia and Africa and Hawaii is where they did some more of their vacationing. So they still really loved to travel. At home, they still loved to entertain guests. They would gather around the piano and sing. Sometimes the guys will set up special treats, like they give helicopter rides from their house around the California coast. And Ted and his friends still loved to play practical jokes on one another. The business of being famous took up a lot of Ted's time now. In 1957 alone, he had almost 1,000 pounds of fan mail. Helen often answered most of his fan mail where people would write letters to him, and she'd sign them from Mrs. Dr. Seuss. Ted still is terrified of speaking in public. Remember from when he was a Boy Scout and they embarrassed him on stage in front of everyone as a kid because he was German when he really did win the contest. But now that he's famous, he sometimes had to give speeches. He found that he could do it as long as he wrote his speech in verse, like to a beat, like he would his books. He once explained to a big group of booksellers, "As everyone present undoubtedly knows, I'm completely incapable of speaking in prose," which means that everything he did was like to this little beat, just like his books. He was not able to just stand up and talk to people like I'm talking to you right now, because it still made him so nervous because of what they did to him as a kid, which is why it's so important that we make good choices. After many happy years together, Helen started to become really sick. And on October 23rd, 1967, she passed away. She was only 68 years old. For 40 years, she took care of everything for Ted. She helped him with all the money. She helped him with writing the letters back to people. She helped him with every single book he wrote. And he didn't know how to live alone. Because remember, she did a lot of this stuff while he just spent his days drawing and writing every day. He needed to find another companion or friend. In 1968, so the following year, he married a new lady named Aubrey Diamond, who was a friend of theirs for years. Ted enjoyed pointing out that when he first met Audrey, not only had she never even read his books before, she'd never even heard of Dr. Seuss. So when he was introduced as our very own Dr. Seuss, she thought that he was actually a medical doctor. She'd never even heard of him before. Audrey quickly became interested in his work, however, and she ended up helping him just like Helen did. Shortly after Ted and Audrey were married, Ted's father dies too at the age of 89. For years, Ted had worried that he'd always disappointed his dad, because remember, his dad wanted him to go to college and do all these things, and he just wanted to write and draw. Sometimes they didn't talk to each other for a long time, but as Ted became more successful and happy with his life, him and his dad had become really good friends. His dad saw that he was actually doing really good with his job and was making money and doing really great work. Ted always treasured this big dinosaur footprint his dad had given him, and he carried it with him his whole life from house to house. But in 1970, Ted's going to start looking out the window and noticing that the view from his house is going to change. He used to look out and see beaches and trees, but now the land was all covered with houses and apartments. So he decided it was time to write a book about how we need to take care of the earth. So for this time, Ted actually thought about the message before he actually started writing the story. We'll see maybe if you know what story he wrote that's talking about how to keep our planet clean and safe. And I will read that story for you tomorrow. So check in tomorrow. Have a good day.